I'm so glad you guys are all able to join us tonight to talk about what you can do for birds. So I'm very grateful that you're all willing to learn more about some simple ways that we can kind of, change our lifestyle slightly to better, the birds and our general ecosystems around us. Want to, necessarily start this presentation with, a bit of doom and gloom, but obviously you guys are all bird watchers or are interested in birds, and so you're probably already kind of aware of this trend. But we are experiencing massive amounts of avian decline in North America. There was a study that came out in 2019 by Rosenberg et al. That kind of shocked the scientific community a little bit. Kind of, was quantifying how many birds we have lost on average, and they were really tracking kind of these trends from 1970 through, over the last 50 years. And we've lost on average of about 3 billion birds throughout North America. To give you kind of a point of reference, that's almost 25% of all birds. The study was also shocking to the scientific community. This study was also showing that it's not just threatened and endangered species that are in decline, it's also a lot of our common everyday birds. So think, like your northern cardinals, American robins, those birds that we pretty much see on a daily basis are also experiencing decline. So you can kind of see that really, really sharp decline in graph A, estimating almost about 3 billion birds in the first 15 years. And, I don't like to, start with the doom and gloom because this is about how we can help birds. So in their graph C, they actually did find there are some birds that are doing okay. So especially our wetland birds are actually showing an increase. There's been a ton of different conservation efforts to our wetland bird species. There is still hope. So I'm hoping, you don't get overwhelmed with seeing, we've lost almost 25% of our birds, but maybe go into this presentation with a little bit of hope that with some of these simple actions, we can potentially combat this loss. And also, grassland birds are experiencing the sharpest decline. And we here in central Illinois kind of have a unique role in combating bird decline because grassland birds are our birds. Illinois is the prairie state. It might not look like it as you're driving around, but through some of our actions, we might be able to kind of stop this grassland decline. And so we're going to kind of cover kind of four main areas. I will say we're going to spend most of our time tonight talking about habitat loss. We're also going to mention things like window collisions, invasive species, and pesticide usage, especially when it talks about insect decline. I also just have some pictures of birds throughout the presentation for you to also enjoy. So I want to start with window collisions because I think it's a problem that's often overlooked, but it's a major killer of our birds. Window collisions cause around 1 billion bird deaths every single year. Birds can't really, see the glass reflection super well. They can't see through it. Instead, they kind of see a reflection of the outside space. So if you kind of look in this picture, that bird is going to see a continuation of that like patio, maybe see the trees in the background, and they're going to try and fly straight into the window to get there. Often they are going, full speed, right head first. It causes a lot of head trauma, internal bleeding, brain swelling, potentially even fracturing skulls. Something that we can easily prevent by adding window decals to our windows. So this image has one of where it's kind of like a dotted grid, but there's tons of different products on the market that have, either dots, stripes. You can even find ones that are like bigger decals of birds or raptors that are pretty common. I will note for some of those other larger decals, it is important to try and have it within like a 2-inch grid. The decals don't really, stop that reflection, and instead kind of almost shows that that bird can't fit through the decals that you're putting up there to get to that next space. So those larger ones obviously are still going to be beneficial, but if you have kind of larger windows, it's a very good idea to get window decals onto your windows, especially if you live in like a high-rise apartment. Obviously, a lot of us here don't live in downtown big cities, but if you're watching this on YouTube later at a different time and you do live in one, it's even more important. I also want to note if a bird does collide into your window, even if they seem stunned and then fly away later, it still usually results in fatality. If you can, after that bird has collided, kind of take it, put it into like a dark box of some sort, like a shoe box. Don't offer it food and water, and then contact, a wildlife rehabber. Typically, if they are, gotten to a rehabber in time, they can be given things like anti-inflammatory meds or supplemental oxygen. Greatly increases their chance of survival. If you're ever looking for a wildlife rehabber, IDNR's website has kind of a list of all the state ones. I know at the park we use Tammy with Hog Capital a ton, and she's helped out with a lot of our kind of bird issues. So highly recommend reaching out to her or other local rehabbers. And so now I want to talk about invasive species. So invasive species are kind of a common theme we'll talk about throughout the presentation. So I want to introduce them first in case you aren't aware of what these are. Essentially, these are organisms that have to fit a few different kind of credentials to meet that, kind of get that title. So first, they have to be not native or introduced to an ecosystem. So essentially, they have to have been, not found in North America or in our area kind of prior to kind of colonizers arriving. So, they are organisms that kind of have very specific relationships that have evolved over, a long, long, long period of time. They also have to cause harm or disrupt that ecosystem, and they also have to spread rapidly. So there's a difference between non-native and invasive. Just because something's not native doesn't always make it invasive. So I like to think of like hostas. They're a common plant that we all kind of know. They're not invasive. They're not really going out and causing harm to our, natural spaces, but they also aren't native. They might not be as beneficial as some of our native species. And invasives kind of pose two different kind of threats, direct and indirect threats. And I want to talk about like house sparrows and European starlings. These are our two kind of more common bird invasive species. So a direct threat is something that you might kind of recognize as a threat from an invasive species easier. This is that kind of organism causing direct harm to another. When we talk about like house sparrows, they are very territorial with their nest sites. They will often go to our other native cavity nesters and destroy their nests, even going to the extent of like breaking the eggs or even killing their young. That's a direct threat. That's something that we can see pretty easily and like know, oh, that is harmful. What's even kind of more harmful to our natives are those indirect threats. These are things that are a lot harder to observe, but it's things, stealing resources from our natives. So things like, cavity sites, food, water, everything that they need to survive. Even if they're not causing a direct harm, they're already kind of taking some of those scarce resources and kind of making it a little bit harder for our natives to survive. And I also want to bring up domestic cats. It's somewhat of a controversial topic. I always want to start. I am a huge cat lover. Cats are one of my absolute favorite animals. I have 4 of them. I couldn't get Fran in the picture with the other 3. She's older, so but domestic cats are not a native species to North America, and they're also one of our largest causes of bird decline. They kill about 2.5 billion birds every single year. Obviously, if you have cats that are outdoors, not only for their sake, but for our birds' sake, keep them indoors. If they are like an outdoor cat, they will never, be tamed enough to go inside. At least keep them contained in like a catio, a barn, shed, etc. Somewhere where they, don't have to be forced inside, but they're also not going to harm our wild bird species. Unfortunately, with cats, they have really dirty mouths. They have a lot of bacteria. I'm sure if you've ever been bitten by a cat and had to get some sort of antibiotic, unfortunately, cats, even if a bird survives a cat attack, that bacteria often causes an infection that causes them to, eventually die later on. And cats also hunt for sport. So even if you're feeding an outside cat, they're still going to, go hunt for birds. That's often why you always hear the stories of people like, oh, my cat's brought me a bird or brought me, a mouse or etc. They are kind of one of a major cause of decline in, not just birds, but also like our small mammals, rodents, amphibians. Okay. So we're going to talk about habitat loss, and I have this split into 3 different sections. So we're going to spend most of our time talking about habitat loss at home, but also then talk about combating habitat loss in our community and abroad. And I want to spend most of our time talking about it at home because I think our yards are a lot more important than some people may think. It's estimated that there's about 40 million acres of lawn space in North America, and that's a lot of unused habitat. I hope after you listen or learn, a few things about how our yards are super important, that you might, especially as we're going into the spring planting season, might also try to make your own yard a bit more beneficial. And so there's a ton of different kind of organizations that have their own, like I call it the yard certifications. They're essentially kind of different programs that have their own kind of individual requirements that you have to kind of meet to, be certified. So there's more local ones like Illinois Audubon Society's Bird and Butterfly Sanctuary. And there's also some of the more well-known ones like the National Wildlife Federation or Homegrown National Park. I will say they all essentially have very similar requirements. Typically, if you're going to meet one of them, you might be, like 80, 90% of the way to meeting another certification. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about all of them. It's essentially they're, food, water, shelter, a place to raise their young, and then some sort of reduced use of pesticides or sustainable gardening methods are kind of all requirements for them. I will say we're going to talk a little bit about Homegrown National Park first. I think this movement is one that helps others kind of conceptualize their yard spaces being more important. So this is a movement co-founded by Doug Tallamy and Michelle Affandari. Kind of a side note, Doug Ptolemy is also an amazing author. He has written tons of books about this very subject. So we're going to talk about, a lot about what he has taught tonight at this presentation. I also brought some of his books, though, for you to look through afterwards. If you've never read any of his books, I highly recommend it. They're great, very informational, and you can learn a lot from them. But essentially, this movement is raising awareness and urgently inspires everyone to address the biodiversity crisis by adding native plants, removing invasive ones where we work, learn, pray, and play. Essentially, what he's saying, so if you take a kind of a step back, our national park system, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, are essentially, these large protected kind of wilderness spaces for some of our wildlife to thrive. This kind of movement is almost turning our own yards into our own little kind of homegrown national parks, with the goal of being, once enough of us kind of make our yards into a mini national park, we'll have enough acreage for it to be considered the largest national park in the States. So we obviously here in Central Illinois don't really live super close to a national park. So their movement is also kind of almost creating pathways between the national parks through our yards. I almost like to think of it as creating, a pathway within our own kind of Peoria Park District properties. I live, very urban West Peoria. So I almost like to think my yard is potentially connecting, like I live kind of by Franciscan Park and also Bradley Park. So I kind of like to think I'm potentially part of that pathway connecting those two kind of somewhat natural spaces. And also Peoria Park District is, ranked one of the best in the states and the nation. So we can, kind of all do our part to kind of help create pathways between some of these areas. And I keep talking about supporting our wildlife because to support our birds, we actually have to support our ecosystems. Birds don't exist in a vacuum. So, we can do things that are a little bit, maybe more geared towards protecting birds in our own yards. But, we really have to kind of take a step back and also realize to support, let's say, like the red-bellied woodpecker, you are also going to have bugs. You're going to have tons of different plants, other animals also using your yard. So it's kind of like you're getting a little bit more value by kind of making your more wildlife friendly. You're not just protecting our birds, but you're also protecting, tons and tons of other different organisms. And, supporting our ecosystem starts with native plants. So this is what you can do for birds. We're going to spend a few slides talking just about plants because of how important they are for our birds. And I do specify by saying native plants. We talked about invasive species and how they're a little bit different than non-native. Our native plants truly are more beneficial to our local wildlife than non-natives. Native plants have those very intricate relationships with insects and our, bird species. So by planting natives in our yard, you're kind of bettering those relationships and kind of supporting that food web. I will, kind of a caveat, if you have non-natives in your yard, as long as they're not invasive, don't feel the need to go and, rip them all out. I kind of like to think if like you already have a bed of non-natives, it's more beneficial to add a bed of natives and leave your bed of non-natives alone. They're not, harmful to our environment. They might not be as beneficial, but they are still more beneficial than like a lawn or a yard. And then I keep saying native without really having defined it. And that kind of is, what is native kind of depends on who you ask. So it can be as simple as, something native to North America, native to Illinois, or, even native specifically to Peoria County. And so when you're going into researching what plants might be native to our area, you kind of might run into this about, how specific do you need to get? So I have a simple range map. The pictures are a little bit, I think you can all see the different shades of green. Okay. This is a simple Bonat map of Lanceleaf coreopsis. It's a prairie plant species that's very pretty. If you don't have one in your yard, highly recommend it. But if you can look, those kind of darker greens means essentially native to the state. The lime green is kind of native to the county. In my own garden, I try to aim for stuff that's, native somewhat to Central Illinois. These maps aren't perfect. They weren't, generated prior to colonization. So there is some gaps in that knowledge. But Illinois is a very long state. So I try to avoid, planting something that's native very super, super far to the south of the state versus something super far north. But, perfection is the thief of progress. So try your best. If there's a native plant that's, maybe native to a few counties over, or, but you really like it, plant it. It's still going to have like benefits to our local ecosystems. So you can even take this like a step further by kind of finding plants that were originally sourced from remnant prairie species. That's much harder. Some people will recommend it too. But, as long as you get close, no one's going to come, rip up your plants. But, and then I also why we really start with plants, I really want to drive this point home just to kind of connect the picture. Birds are consumers. I don't know any birds that photosynthesize, but that would be quite cool to have. And so to have consumers, be able to survive on your property, you have to have a really strong foundation. So this image is like a very basic kind of trophic level, kind of showing how energy transfers to an ecosystem. And roughly only about 10% of energy really goes to that next trophic level. So you have to have a huge foundation of plants, that first trophic level, to really start kind of getting the others to be able to use your yard. So if you want things like your hawks, falcons, and owls, the really, really cool birds, they're tertiary consumers. You have to have a really strong foundation. Maybe if you might even have to get your neighbors to kind of help out a little bit too. They require a ton of, essentially plants to survive. And our lawns are typical, or our typical lawns are food deserts. So if you currently have a lawn that's, perfectly manicured, maybe you have like Creeping Charlie or a few others, I call them like lawn crap. They're little plants that kind of spread throughout your yard. You're not really providing a lot of food for our, not only our birds, but also our insects. So insects are a major portion of our birds' diets, especially this time of the year as they're raising your young. You've probably all seen the statistic kind of thrown around where it's like 1,000 caterpillars are needed to like raise a chickadee's clutch. I feel like I've seen that post on Facebook multiple times already this year. And it's kind of true. You need a ton of insects to really help those birds kind of, raise that next generation. But also our lawns don't really, produce seed, fruit, nuts, nectar, all other types of food that our birds really need to survive. So remove your lawns. This is the perfect time of year to kind of start scaling back how much lawn you truly have. Obviously, lawns have a usage, but some, you might have more lawn than you typically need. I'm not saying you can't have zero grass. Some grass is okay, especially if you need it for like recreational purposes. But really kind of take a look at what your current home landscaping is using, or what you are using it for, and maybe see where you can potentially put in some more native plants. I do want to note, check with your city ordinances, your HOAs, neighborhood associations. A lot of them have requirements of how much grass you actually have to have. It's crazy how we have regulated, you have to have a specific amount of grass in your yard or you'll get, a ticket, for example. So I know like West Peoria, where it's, I think 40% of our front yard is allowed to be a garden and 60% of your backyard is allowed to be kind of a maintained garden. So push those limits. I'm not saying get in trouble, but if you want to, plant exactly 40, maybe 50%, if that's your rule, go right ahead. And then there's also the new Homeowners Native Landscaping Act that passed a few years ago in Illinois. It's kind of trying to restrict some of those HOAs from restricting you from planting specific native species. I will say there's a lot of loopholes in this from my understanding, so it can still kind of limit to make sure your yard looks neat or clean or tidy. But I think if you're running into problems with this, maybe send them this video about why lawns are so bad and why natives are very important. But you could also start documenting what uses your yard, and that might also change some minds. And so I'll stop talking about plants after this slide, I swear. But I wanted to leave you some more resources, especially a few that I've used personally. So like Illinois Native Plant Society, their website has a ton of information. I really, really like it they actually have a whole list of all native plant sales in our area. So Peoria doesn't have too many. There are still a few, especially like at Haddad's grocery store in West Peoria. The Friends of Rocky Glen, Friends of Horseshoe Bottoms host their annual sale. There's also a ton in like Bloomington, Champaign. Typically, these are a good place to potentially find some of those, local kind of plants that were sourced from wild seeds, but also a fairly easy way to find potentially kind of more inexpensive plants. I also want to mention two local ones that I've used are Pleasant Prairie Nursery and Best Buds. Pleasant Prairie is a little bit further of a drive if you do live in Lake Peoria, but it's highly worth the drive. They have plants, I think they're $5 a plant this year. They're kind of smaller plugs. I will say, even though they're smaller, every single plant I planted from them last year did survive the winter, but you might not get as many blooms in that first year. Some of our natives take, 2-3 years or so to kind of establish themselves, but it's a great way to kind of get a huge quantity of plants for fairly cheap. Best Buds is another local one in West Peoria. These plants are a little bit pricier, but you get much more established plants. And he himself is extremely knowledgeable. You walk in, any single question you might have, he will answer it. Auburn Acres and Mason State Nursery are both two others I've heard really good kind of recommendations from. I personally never used them, but I wanted to mention them. And then Prairie Moon Nursery is kind of an oddball on this slide. They're actually based in Minnesota, so nowhere near us, but they have really, really high quality native plants. I also want to mention how useful their website is. So even if you don't end up ordering plants from Prairie Moon, the amount of information they have for natives is insane. You can look up any native plant that you might be interested in. It'll have things like its bloom time, how high it gets, how wide it gets, how aggressive it is, what insects it's a host plant for, if it's deer resistant, bunny resistant, if it's specifically more beneficial to birds. I've ordered from them a few times. I've always had great plants, but I think I've used their website. I can't even count how many times I have referenced their website just for kind of basic native plant information. And say we're also the prairie state. We have tons of pretty natives. Natives often kind of get a bad rap for maybe looking a little bit more untidy, but they are beautiful. I think they're even prettier than most of the ornamentals that you can even find at most box stores. So we're done about plants, but I still want to talk about kind of making our yards a little bit more wildlife friendly. Just a few more kind of tidbits. So water sources are extremely important things to add. It can be as simple as something like a bird bath, all the way up to like a wildlife pond or a container pond. Obviously, this is much more of a financial and labor-intensive commitment, but it can have much more of an impact on not only our birds but other local organisms. I will say if you do put out a bird bath or even a bird feeder, those can be very good at attracting a lot of birds at once. Those are both kind of limiting resources in especially urban areas. Just keep an eye on the birds that are using it. If you see a sick bird coming to your feeder, your bird bath, take it down, sanitize it, maybe even leave it down for a week or so that sick bird might, go away and disperse and not attracting a sick bird and potentially infecting others that are using them. They're also really important in the winter. So if you have like a dunk heater or a heated bird bath, they can also be very beneficial. And then just a few other smaller things that you might want to consider adding, not directly for our birds, but something like an insect bowl where it's like a shallow kind of bowl of water where you put sticks and rocks in it so the insects don't drown as they're drinking, or something like a butterfly puddling station, which is kind of like a larger saucer, kind of fill it with like a soil, usually add like minerals or salts to it, kind of keep it muddy. Butterflies love it. So it's a great way if you're already supporting, butterflies to your yard, kind of another kind of good way to kind of boost them. I also want to talk about kind of a shelter or place to raise your young. Obviously, we can protect the birds that are already alive, but we have to also help them raise that next generation. And so most people are going to think of bird boxes. Bird boxes are essentially cavity nests. So you're going to be attracting cavity nesting species. And there's kind of a caveat to opening cavity nests. Unfortunately, house sparrows and European starlings, those two invasive birds we talked about earlier, are both cavity nesters, and they will readily use cavity nests that you put out in your yard. So if you live somewhere extremely urban like I do, there's a very good chance you're never going to attract the eastern bluebird to your yard. There's just too much competition with those invasives. So something that you can easily do is kind of put out a bird box that has a smaller opening, typically recommended to have it as like at 1 1/8 of an inch or smaller. You'll still get things like black-capped chickadees, house wrens, Carolina wrens, but typically your house sparrows and starlings kind of won't be able to use those small of an openings. You can also hang like the hanging wren boxes. I've heard house sparrows don't like those hanging nest sites as much as wrens do. I have not used a hanging one before, so you'll have to kind of tell me about your own experience with using those. Another kind of easy way to add, without having to manage a bird box. Oh, I should mention, house sparrows and European starlings are not protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. You can, and I highly recommend removing their nest. It seems kind of cruel, but they are kind of displacing our native species. So if you do, make sure you're 100% certain the species of bird that's using your nest, obviously, before going and interfering with it. If you ever have trouble identifying a bird, there's tons of resources online to help. You could even post it in the Peoria Audubon's kind of public Facebook group. Tons of people are always willing to help you identify the bird, but they can, have such a negative impact that if you do have a bluebird box up and you attract like a house sparrow, I do recommend, removing the nest. It's a pretty passive way of kind of lowering their population. But you can also, having mature trees, leaving like dense shrubbery, or even, if you have like prairie grasses, it's another great way for, give a nesting site for birds. But if you can also safely, and I do mean safely, leave up a dead tree or a snag, that can be very beneficial as well. Obviously, if that dead tree is going to fall on your house, fall on someone, harm someone, please take it down. For us to, continue protecting birds, we also have to protect ourselves. So if you have the space for it, please leave them up. If not, please don't. Also talk about pesticides. So if you aren't familiar, pesticides are essentially different kind of chemicals that target specific organisms. So things like insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, etc. They are very harmful when used incorrectly. And I will say most of the general population are going to use them incorrectly. Anyone can walk into a big box store and walk out with a pesticide and have almost zero idea of actually how to use it. They do have a place in conservation, especially herbicides when combating invasive plant species, but those are typically used by people that are trained on how to minimize their impact on surrounding organisms. So I don't want to, discredit the use of pesticides, but if you are going to use them, just make sure you're trained in using them. And I'll talk a little bit about some places you can volunteer in the area to potentially be trained on how to use specific ones. Insecticides are probably one of the biggest ones that are kind of causing bird decline. We are experiencing massive insect decline across the globe. Some scientists are considering it to be like an ecological Armageddon with how many bugs we've lost. There's a study that came out in Germany that they were the ones who kind of coined that term, that they were estimating that we've lost about 75% of our winged insects. And so, if you think back to that trophic level, that is our primary consumers. If you take out that whole kind of part of the pyramid, everything else crashes. So you can plant as many natives as you want, but if you are, spraying your yard for insecticides or spraying insecticides in your yard, you're still not going to be able to benefit the birds. I will note there's a lot of different services that offer, someone that comes out and like sprays your yard for like mosquitoes. Typically, even if they're marketing and saying it only targets mosquitoes, it's going to target, other insects as well. So if you have a problem with mosquitoes, there's actually the mosquito bucket challenge from Homegrown National Park. It's kind of a much safer way to target mosquitoes in your yard. Essentially, you put out a 5-gallon bucket, you fill it with water, obviously leave it stagnant, so don't put any like bubbler or fountain in it. Kind of put leaves, or you kind of want to make it stinky for the attract the mosquitoes, and then you put a mosquito dunk in the bucket. So mosquitoes are attracted to it. They might try to lay their eggs or raise their young, but the mosquito dunk prevents it. It's a much less impactful way of controlling mosquito populations in your yard, and also protecting our other the good insects. All insects are good. Things eat mosquitoes, but obviously some people can be very sensitive to them. I also want to mention rodenticides. Rodenticides are kind of, like the chemicals you put out to control like mice or rats in your garage, your basement, etc. Unfortunately, a lot of the times when those kind of, what you're targeting eats those and then goes and dies, something else eats them. So this can be things like your owls, snakes, anything that eats those it's almost a free meal for them. So I have a picture of Jessie and myself. Jessie is our extremely senior barn owl. I think she's turning 23 this spring. Lived quite a long life in captivity, but in the wild, they actually only average about 3 to 5 years. And one of the reasons why people are, kind of thinking they might have such a short lifespan is the use of rodenticides. I mean, they do live in barns, hence the name barn owl, and that's often where we, are putting these out to control rodent populations. So if you want more owls or hawks, in your yard, in your area, using more kind of things like snap traps to control potential pest species is a great way. Obviously, don't use glue traps. Those can be very, they're not very ethical in my opinion. So using something like a snap trap can be a lot less impactful in our kind of local ecosystems. We've talked everything about habitat loss in our home. It's obviously the big chunk of the program tonight. I have a few other things I want to mention towards the, as we're kind of wrapping this up. So combating habitat loss in our community. You already talked about Peoria Wilds. Supporting our local land trust, Peoria Wilds, is very important. They are helping to hold land in conservation. I won't go into too much detail because we did just have that monthly meeting about that. You can find it on our YouTube channel, just searching kind of what I have up there, or just search Peoria Wilds, Peoria Audubon into YouTube, and it should come up for you. Or financially supporting other conservation organizations in our area. It's hard to combat habitat loss in our community without a financial source. Obviously, the best way to combat habitat loss is to just buy land and put it back into conservation. So if you aren't able to do that, you can also volunteer to combat habitat degradation, which is a little bit different than habitat loss, but also just as important. So, it's important to have land that's, keep it kind of wild or natural. We also still have to maintain those lands. So there's a ton in our area. I've picked a few, like Peoria Park District has a ton of different opportunities to go and kind of remove invasive plant species from their preserves. Prairie Land Conservancy, especially the Elwood Preserve, which is kind of one that's pretty local to us. And then also Illinois Audubon Society has a ton of other kind of volunteer opportunities at some of their local preserves. And I have two invasive species that are both, well, garlic mustard is now in bloom. It's and then bush honeysuckle is almost in bloom. I will say once you learn how to identify bush honeysuckle, it's almost like a curse. You will see it everywhere you go. But they're both going into bloom. So if you see these kind of on your property, it's a great way to kind of learn what they look like this time of the year. And then habitat loss abroad, we mentioned the shade-grown coffee, or the Smithsonian certified bird-friendly coffee. We had a whole other meeting about this too, so I won't go too much into detail about this. But it's really important to not only think about habitat loss in our own area, but also abroad. Birds, a lot of our birds only spend half their lives here. They, do migrate south in the wintertime. I mean, a lot of us are coffee drinkers, especially here in the States. But most of the coffee we buy in the stores is sun-grown coffee, which, kind of think almost monoculture row crops. They don't really support a lot of wildlife and unfortunately cause a lot of harm to those habitats. So buying something like bird-friendly shade-grown coffee is a pretty simple change to, kind of better birds across the globe. I will say I also recently made the switch after learning more about it. I didn't think I would taste the difference. It is night and day. It tastes so much better. It's a little bit more pricey, but highly recommend it. There's tons and tons and tons of different brands and flavors and anything you can think of. But if you haven't made the switch, I recommend it. I also want to talk about citizen science. So if you aren't familiar with what citizen science is, it's essentially scientists using the general public to kind of gather data for them. So a lot of us birders probably already use eBird, essentially where you submit the checklist of what birds you've seen, how many you've seen, where you've seen them, or what time you saw them, and then that gets looked over by a local reviewer before getting moved into kind of a research database. But there's a ton of other kind of opportunities for citizen science. So one is like iNaturalist. This one is not just for birds; it's for pretty much anything you can see out in nature. So even if you aren't a huge bird lover, you can still contribute by submitting things like different plants or insects, fungi, etc. There's also one Xenocanto. We talked about audio recording. That one is more specifically for wildlife audio recording. And it's a kind of a good resource to contribute to if you can, because other users can then also look up those sound recordings. So especially if you're studying bird sounds, it'd be a great way to learn. There's also like our local spring and Christmas bird counts, where you have to be an experienced birder for this one, unfortunately, but you essentially get assigned to like a specific part of our county, and you have essentially a whole day to go and kind of find as many birds as possible in that area. And there's also like larger ones like the Great Backyard Bird Counts, where it's not as kind of established like a eBird or iNaturalist, where you can use it anytime you go out, but kind of a more specific type of event. So some final thoughts. Hope I didn't bore you too much tonight. I couldn't talk about decline in birds without mentioning climate change. Climate change is the greatest environmental challenge of our time. I could probably talk to you for hours about climate change and its impact on birds. So I didn't want to bore you with that too much tonight, but I think it's something we kind of always have to keep in the back of our mind when we're talking about bird decline. And if you've never calculated your own ecological footprint, it's kind of a great place to start at looking at our own contributions to climate change. Americans, we only make up about 5% of the global population, but we actually consume almost 30% of the world's resources. We love to consume everything. I'm also kind of an affiliate instructor at Bradley as my part-time job, and that's one of the first assignments a lot of my students do. It's actually calculating their own ecological footprints. And it can be mind-opening or kind of eye-opening when you see that, if everyone on Earth had your lifestyle, we would need 5, 6, 7 Earths essentially to support the population. It really kind of scares them a little bit to like, oh, I really do have an impact on, climate change, and through some small actions, which that site, I won't go too much into detail about it, but that site can kind of help you look at like what resources you're using and potentially how to kind of slow it down. Also, everything we talked about, it's a marathon, not a sprint. We talked about it a lot. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. I would rather you make a few small, sustainable changes in your life than try everything all at once, get frustrated, and stop and do nothing. So even if you only take a few of these recommendations, even if you just start with one, you can still have an impact. And lastly, go appreciate birds. To care for our birds, we first have to appreciate them. And so I kind of challenge, I'm assuming most of us are bird watchers here, otherwise you probably wouldn't be at our meetings. But if you're going to go bird watching, especially during the spring migration, try and take a non-bird watcher with you. A lot of people, they might say, oh, it's a bird. Like they see birds, but they don't really know the birds. They don't know what a black-capped, even those common everyday birds that, black-capped chickadee, those ones that you can spot and you like know it immediately. They have no idea those exist. And they don't really care to protect them if they don't have a relationship with them. So even if you only take, your neighbor, coworker, friend, family, stranger, I don't care. Take someone and help them try and appreciate some of the birds. You already mentioned some of our upcoming events, so I won't mention it again. I will mention the casual bird outing because if you're going to take a non-birder, this is the best place to start. This is very low pressure. You don't even need to know how to identify a bird. You don't even have to have binoculars. We'll have a few spare pairs, but it's open to everyone. It's pretty kind of more of a social setting. Meet some like-minded individuals and also appreciate some of the birds as they're migrating through. And then obviously our next monthly meeting is May 13th with Mike Miller. And then I'll end with any questions. I do want to note, if you don't have any or you think of some later, feel free to send me in an email. I left my work email up there. I'm generally good about responding to them fairly quickly, but I will, always happy to answer questions about birds and how we can kind of better them in our area. And thank you guys again for coming. I really appreciate it.
You have the cruted decals for windows. I want to recommend it to a friend who's got very extensive windows. Do those go on the inside or the outside?
I think outside. I think some products might be a little bit different, but the ones we have at least were outside, but there's tons of them on the market. But yeah. Oh yeah. And they're fairly, I would say they're fairly easy to install. It did take us a little bit, but that was probably user error. So the actual best ones to look for are what's called keystone species. So Doug Ptolemy talks about this a ton, but keystone species are essentially those organisms that have a huge impact on the your local ecosystem, maybe even more of an impact than others. But read his books to learn more, but there's tons. Like oak trees are a keystone species. They support a ton of wildlife, so that's a great one. Like goldenrod is another really great one. But yeah, keystone species, if you want to have the most impact, especially if you have a smaller yard, it's kind of great to kind of try and get as many of those into your landscaping.